Hi, good morning. Happy March. Can you believe it's March? Like, where did this semester go? Like, it feels like it was, I don't know, it feels like it was a very long time ago that we started, but the weeks feel like they're going really quickly. I don't know. Weird to think that it's March. I'm like, my cruise is in 26 days. Not that I'm counting or anything, but I'm so excited. I printed all the menus over the weekend, like the menu for every restaurant. I have like my meals mapped out. That's that's really all I care about on the trip. I'm so excited for like lots of meals, like unlimited pizza. I have it all planned out, right? I'm ready to go. Like eat at the main dining room, then upstairs for a second dinner, and then where the dessert places are. Like I said, I plan to gain a good 10 pounds that week. That's my goal, right? Ready. 26 days. But I had another thought, but it left me. Did anyone? I recorded the lecture last week. Did anyone watch it? Did anyone who missed watched it? I recorded one on accident on Wednesday, and all it was, I left the camera on accident, and it was like my stomach the whole time, so I didn't post that one. But I recorded. I'm trying to record the lectures. I think that it turned out okay. I watched the first like 15 minutes, and it seemed fine. But if you miss, I have been recording them and posting them on Canvas. So just if you have to miss for whatever reason, it will be there for you. So hopefully that's kind of a good thing. We'll see. I imagine the quality is not perfect, but it's got to be better than nothing. But otherwise, we'll get back into mood disorders. We have the other half to go, right? So we'll talk today about some of the other causes. We kind of got through this slide, but we'll talk about some of the biological treatments and then the other causes and treatments, and then bipolar disorder. So we got through this one, right? Last time we spent a lot of time talking about major depression, major depressive episodes to have unipolar depression, and then these genetic and like biological factors, which play a huge role. And so if we build on that a little bit, if we believe that neurotransmitters are the problem, right, or we believe that it's something biological, then we're going to use a biological approach, right? If we go back to those models that we talked about back in chapter 2, if we think it's a physical culprit, then we'll use a physical attack, if you will, a physical treatment. And so one of the most common treatments by far for depression is an antidepressant drug, right? And there are so many of these. I guarantee a lot of you have known somebody who's taken one, or maybe is taking one, or have taken one yourselves. They're very, very, very common. An antidepressant is a medication that helps fight depression, right? They actually have a lot of other uses too. They're very commonly used for anxiety and like other like kind of off-label things as well. But depression is the main use for them. And there's a whole ton of these, and they fall into 4 main groups. MAO inhibitors, or MAOIs, sometimes we call them the MAOIs. The tricyclics or tricyclics, SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and SNRIs, serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So all of these are working on those different neurotransmitters that are involved with causing depression, right? So they all work in a slightly different way, and some are better than others, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I have a little clip that introduces these. It's not super thrilling, but I do think it's a little bit helpful. And then we'll talk about it more. I'm going to write a few things on the board as it goes through the little clip here. Let me start that. To pause this of all videos, but I do think it does a really nice job like introducing those different categories here. Let's bring this back. So they go over them in a slightly different order. I have them listed up here on the board and then also in the slide. In order from like oldest to newest, you could also think about it as almost like worst to best. The last 2 are a little bit subjective, but the first 2 up here, MAOIs, or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, if you want the full name, these are the oldest group, right? These were discovered in like the 1950s, 1960s. They're really, really indirect in the way that they work. Right, so what they do is they reduce a substance in your body called monoamine oxidase, which is in the definition here, if you're wondering how you spell that. But they reduce this substance in your system, which then increases serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So we're decreasing one thing to thereby increase 3 others. And because it's doing so many different things in your body, it causes a lot of side effects. These first two up here are older, and the side effects that they produce tend to be worse. There's more of them than the newer ones, which have less side effects. So things like the MAOIs and tricyclics are almost never prescribed anymore, right? These are like the 1950s and the 1970s that these drugs were being developed. The most common MAOI is a drug called Nardil. It's not even something that is really used anymore, but these were the first ones that came out, followed by the tricyclics or tricyclics. I've heard it said both ways. These ones eliminate one step, so they're a little bit better, right? They eliminate the MAO part, but these ones work to increase serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So they're still affecting 3 different neurotransmitters. They also tend to have a lot of side effects. Elavil is the most common one of these. Again, something that's not typically prescribed anymore. Usually when you go into a doctor, they're going to prescribe something from these 2 categories down below, because these ones here are the ones that are newer and have less side effects. But those 2 are worth mentioning. Sometimes they're used, but not very often, because the side effects they produce tend to be pretty decent. The SSRIs and SNRIs both work on limiting the reuptake of serotonin or serotonin and norepinephrine, right? When neurons communicate with each other, they release all these neurotransmitters out into the synapse, and then they're reabsorbed after that communication has taken place. What both of these do is they limit the reabsorption, that reuptake piece, which is where the R comes from, right? And so there's more of these different neurotransmitters to help fight off the depression. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, only affect serotonin. So they're very selective, hence the name, right? They're very targeted, very specific. And so they tend to have less side effects because they're only affecting serotonin. Does that make sense? Right? These ones are affecting lots of other things, so they tend to have more of a global effect, much more specific and much more targeted. SSRIs are ones like Prozac, Celexa, Lexapro, Zoloft, right? Those are ones that are much more common. You've probably seen commercials for some of those on TV. They're much more commonly used. These ones work very, very similarly, but they add norepinephrine, right? So instead of just targeting serotonin, they also target norepinephrine, right? And so these ones are also very, very commonly used. Cymbalta, Effexor, Pristiq, there's a whole bunch of these as well. There's always new ones being developed as well, and you'll see them all the time on TV. But these ones are both very, very commonly used. Now, if you're wondering, how do we know which one to use? We don't. It's a lot of trial and error, sadly. And if any of you have ever been on an antidepressant or known someone who has, it can be super frustrating because it can take a while to find the right one. Somebody will go in and they're struggling with depression, and the doctor will be like, all right, I'm going to give you a shot on an SSRI. We're going to try Zoloft, and we'll see how it works. And maybe someone has very minimal side effects and it works fine, and we're just kind of tweaking the dosage. If they can't tolerate the side effects or it isn't helping, then maybe we try a drug from a different category, right? So we have to look at the symptoms somebody's displaying. And then sadly from there, it's a lot of trial and effort. There's no way to actually test, which one do we need to do other than more like trial and effort or trial and error based efforts. Yeah. I heard the first part, but what was said, I'm going to say. There's so many advantages, right, in neurobiology, but we don't have a way to test the amount of norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine in the system yet. So we can test hormone levels in the blood, but we can't test neurotransmitter levels between synapses. We just don't have that capability yet. If we do one day, can you imagine how much that would help? Well, we could specify and target it, but we sadly don't have that ability at all. We're not even close. So all we have to do is try the drugs out and see how they affect people. Norepinephrine and serotonin control slightly different things. So depending on somebody's symptoms, whether they're having like weight gain or weight loss, insomnia or hypersomnia, it might guide that like psychiatrist or doctor, but sadly we can't test for it all yet. Anyone know someone who's taken an antidepressant at some point? Okay. A lot of you, any comments or stories or thoughts or anything about it, their experience or your awareness of it, anything at all? Yeah.
My dad is bipolar, so he's on a bunch of different stuff. Sure, take some antidepressants. And it's always interesting because he's tried to get off of them a few times with doctor regulations and never really goes very well because eventually you start to rely on them, right?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Right, and I think we talked about this a little last time, right? That some people can go off of them and be okay, but they start to taper you off, right? And if your symptoms start to come back, then you usually have to go back on it again. So some people can, and some people have to take them for a really long time. Yeah, but it can be unsuccessful when people try to go off. Anybody else? Anyone else that comments on these? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take antidepressants,
Mhm.
so trying to figure out the right ones. When it tested, I guess, it was a new side effects, so that triggered me the depression.
Yeah. And that's so frustrating, right? Like you're going in for depression and you take a drug that's supposed to help you when you feel worse. And what happens, right? If you've ever listened to the side effects, and I'm going to play a commercial for you in a couple minutes. That's one of the things that they mentioned. It can cause an increase in depression or suicidal thoughts. And that's just maddening. You're hoping to feel better, and now you feel worse. And the side effects sometimes can outweigh the benefit of the drug. But sometimes people, any drug, this is true of any single drug, right? Like I can't take NyQuil. I get like loopy. It's ridiculous. Like I sleepwalk. I don't know where I am. Like it's just NyQuil. And you would think that I took something way more serious. If I take NyQuil, I'm just lost. Like my partner has found me wandering through the house if I take NyQuil. I know better. Right? Like for me, the side effects of it outweigh the benefit of sleeping. I have to find other ways to fall asleep if I'm sick. Right. And with these, sometimes people have that too, where like the side effects are so uncomfortable that they would rather deal with the depression. Right. And then when you find the right drug, it can be super helpful, but it can take so much time sometimes to get there. Not only the right drug, but the right dosage, or like you said, your dad's on a lot of different things. Sometimes it's combinations of drugs that you have to find in a way to have them work together successfully. So not to make it sound discouraging, these drugs are life changers for people, but it can take a little bit of time to find the right one. Any other comments, thoughts, stories, anything? I want to play a commercial for you, and I just typed in like YouTube antidepressant commercial, and the first one that came up that was like newer was a Cymbalta commercial, and so I want to play that for you. These drug companies, the drugs, when they're advertised, you are legally required to list the side effects. Now this has become like a running joke in my house. Like whenever there's a drug commercial, we always laugh at the names because the names for the drugs are just ridiculous sometimes, right? But we always pay attention to the side effects that they list. Sometimes the side effects are ridiculous. If you've ever consciously listened to them, like there was one on the other night for, it was like quitting smoking. And the side effects were like death, seizures, heart attacks. It was like, you have to weigh these things when you're making a decision. But I'm going to play the Cymbalta one for you. Just listen to the side effects. These are really common and definitely something that you have to consider. This many side effects, right? And those are just the things that people can experience. Not everybody experiences all of those, but it's a little staggering sometimes to listen to it, like all of the things that they say can happen. And some people tolerate these really, really well. And others, right, it can be a little bit of a challenge. My parents have always been like drug pushers, right? That sounds funny, but like it's always been their style. Like in high school, I struggled a lot with depression, and rather than seeing it just like a normal developmental thing, it was like, we need to get you on medication. And I remember very clearly, the first one I took was, I just forgot the name of it. It was, oh my gosh, just blanked out on it. I took a drug, like an antidepressant drug. And the first thing that happened was like, I hallucinated from it. Like I've never hallucinated in my life until I took this medication. Like the desks were floating in my room. I was terrified. So I was so jaded after that. I was like, I don't want to take one. They make me see things, right? Some people like to see things, but not so much for me. I mean, they just can have so many side effects, but then you find the right one and it's like everything clicks. So just, I guess the one thing I would say is to be patient if you end up going in or know somebody who's trying to find the right one. Once you get there, they can be incredibly helpful, but it can take a little bit of time. So very, very common. These are used a lot, sometimes on their own, sometimes with therapy, They can be combined together or used separately, but this is the most common by far approach to treating depression. And then sometimes bipolar disorder, but there are drugs that tend to be more used for that we'll talk about a little later. There are a couple of other biological treatments, but these are never the first line of defense, never. Like if you went into your doctor and you were like, I'm struggling with depression, they wouldn't give you electroconvulsive therapy, right? Like that would never happen. These are typically for cases of very severe depression, people who are unresponsive to medication, or like deeply suicidal. These are things that are used for way more intense or severe cases, but they have been shown to be helpful, some of them more than others. But some of these that are up here, like electroconvulsive therapy, is kind of the old standby. This is a very old procedure, but it's still used pretty heavily today. Interesting history, right? So we tried for many, many years to induce seizures in patients to see if it would help them in some way. Now, remember that we talked about a brain circuit for depression. So the idea is that the brain is underactive in some places. And so if we can stimulate the brain, maybe we get those channels working and alleviate depression. And so for years, like if you go back in history, we would cause people to have seizures through like different substances and cause them to lose consciousness. In 1937, and you don't need to know the year or anything, but in 1937, we tried the first electrical current on a patient. I would hate to be that like guinea pig, right? But in 1937, there was a patient who had schizophrenia, was really unresponsive to medication, hadn't spoken a word in months. And so they ran a current of, I wrote it down, what was it? How many watts? I can't find it. 62 watts, right? That they ran through this guy. They put a little conductor on either side of the head, gave him a shock using like an early version of electroconvulsive therapy. He had a grand mal seizure, which meant he lost consciousness for a matter of seconds. And then he sat up, swore at them and said, what are you doing to me? Like, what the F are you doing to me? They considered it a great success, right? He spoke for the first time in a long time. And so we've been refining it for a long time since then, but this is something that's been around for a long time. And for a long time, we didn't really know why it worked until we discovered those brain circuits for depression. So with electroconvulsive therapy, which again is very old, the idea here is that you pass an electrical current through somebody's brain, causing them to have a seizure where they lose consciousness for a matter of seconds. And it's thought to like activate or reboot the brain in some way. Really, really unrefined people have a lot of side effects from this procedure. Memory loss, right? They can hurt themselves, right? Sometimes people will pull muscles because they're flailing from the seizure. We tend to give people like a sedative now or a muscle relaxant so that doesn't happen. But it's an outpatient procedure. You go in and have several rounds of this done over about 12 weeks. And it's thought to slowly increase the activity in the brain and alleviate depression. Again, never a first line offense because it's pretty invasive, right? And people can have a lot of side effects from it. We have a couple of newer ones. Now, vagus nerve stimulation and deep brain stimulation are both really, really invasive procedures, like implanting things into the brain, implanting pacemakers that send an electrical current up your vagus nerve. They aren't used very frequently, but this one right here is starting to gain a lot of popularity. TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, is probably the future of brain stimulation methods. Right? The reason it's not more popular is it's ridiculously expensive. Insurance doesn't tend to cover it, so not a lot of people use it. It's like $10,000 a cycle, right? And so it's very private and not something that's used frequently. People are still using electroconvulsive therapy, but this is kind of the future. What they do is they place a small magnetic coil right above the head, and it's thought to activate Brodmann area 25, that tiny little region of the brain that we talked about previously. And it doesn't include any kind of seizure or any kind of shock. And so it's gaining popularity, but again, it's still very, very expensive. So it's not used as much as it maybe should be. But these are all things that would be used in a much more severe case. I have a little clip of the TMS. It talks about it a little bit. It's a little skewed in that it's like a company talking about their products, so you have to always keep that in mind. But I'll play it for you. I think it's kind of helpful, and they show you what the procedure looks like. Let me bring that up. I have to minimize the video. Back on, where they place that little machine right above the head. They're not passing like a shock. There's nothing like invasive. It looks much more calm than something like electroconvulsive therapy. And that tiny little part of the brain that it activates is that Brodmann area 25 that we talked about, right? That's in charge of serotonin. And so it's thought to be really, really helpful. But as I said, it's still so expensive and it's very privatized at the moment. Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Typically, we don't use these things on people who are under 18, under any circumstance.
So.
I'm sorry. Sorry. For some reason, I'm not. Go ahead.
Does it fully develop until you're in correct?
Yeah, so it's still developing.
So this is like if we right not to use it for the first
Probably logical, right? And I'm not sure if there is a hard limit on it, but typically, as I said, these things are used for people who are like in very severe cases. So oftentimes we would try everything else before we would even consider something like this. So I don't know if there's a hard rule, but I mean, that's definitely something that would make sense, right? You would not want to use this on somebody who is younger, could have any damage from it. We still don't know the long-term effects of some of these things. So it's pretty logical that it would be used on somebody who's much younger than not. Like I know it would be used under 15, but I don't know if they have a rule. Like if anyone wants to look it up, if you want to look it up and let me know if you find anything. It's definitely a logical assumption, right? And the other ones, like the deep brain stimulation, that one's almost never used, right? That's something that's more like in a trial stage. And the vagus nerve stimulation, same thing. It's so invasive, right? Where they're implanting a pacemaker that activates and sends signals up your vagus nerve on each side of your neck. Really, this is the future right here, but we still use ECT all the time, or shock therapy or electroshock therapy. I almost said it was shocking that we still use it. That'd be a really good pun or a really bad pun. I don't know, one or the other. But it is kind of shocking, right? I mean, it's such an invasive thing to cause somebody to have a seizure, and it can be helpful, but again, usually it's like a last ditch effort. You would never do these things before trying everything else first. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, anything before we keep going? One other very common explanation for depression, and then we'll talk about bipolar disorder, is the cognitive side. So depression can obviously be caused by a lot of things. Biology is a huge contributor, but so is the cognitive model. Your thoughts, your thinking can contribute heavily, not only to causing depression, but maintaining it, right? And oftentimes when people are depressed, which we talked about last time, they don't think clearly, right? Very common to not make great decisions, to be in kind of like a mental fog when you're depressed. There's something that psychologist Aaron Beck is really famous for his work on cognition and depression, so much so that he has something called the BDI. You don't need to know this, but in case you're interested, BDI, which is the Beck Depression Inventory. It's a very common scale used for people who are struggling with depression. And so sometimes people who are cognitive therapists who focus exclusively on thinking will give their clients the BDI every session to kind of get an indicator of how they're doing, right? Like at the beginning of a session, you would take this quick inventory. It's not that many questions, and you get a score of how depressed you are. And you might use that as like a check-in. But Aaron Beck is probably one of the most famous for his work with the cognitive element of depression. And he talked about something called the Cognitive Triad. Very, very common in people who are struggling with depression. He said it would make you feel depressed, it would maintain depression. And the triad is there's a negative view of self, a negative view of the world and experiences, and a negative view of the future. So you have all three of those things working together. And this would be a great short answer question for you on the next exam. You obviously have a study guide, but just to point that out, right? If I asked you what are the three elements of Beck's cognitive triad, you would say a negative view of self, a negative view of the world or experiences, and then a negative view of the future. So having all three of those things tends to be problematic and contribute pretty heavily to depression. The automatic thoughts that you have are playing a role. What is the instant thought that pops into your head? Are they negative? But if you're having negative automatic thoughts or really inaccurate automatic thoughts, they can heavily contribute to how you react to things. Really easy example, right? And I'm sure some of you have done this to an extent, but let's say you take an exam and you fail it, right? You take a test, you get a bad grade on it, whether that's a C or a D or a B. For me, a bad grade's a B, right? Whatever that bad grade is, right? You instantly might have a reaction, especially if you were depressed, of like, see, I knew I'm not good at anything, right? Like I knew I could never pass this test, right? I'm never going to accomplish anything. I'm stupid. My teacher thinks I'm stupid. My parents think I'm stupid. And then it escalates from there, right? You have this negative self-view. And then it can go to like, see, if I can't pass this test, I'm never going to pass this class. If I don't pass this class, I'm never going to graduate college. And then if I don't graduate college, I'll never have a good job. If I don't get a good job, no, I'm never going to have any money. No one's going to love me. I might as well die now. Right? It's that escalation. It happens like this. When people are depressed, they tend to have this like massive overreaction to something so small, right? Maybe the exam was a bad test, or maybe you didn't study enough, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a reflection on your entire life future, right? So to some degree, we all go through some of that, but when we have these automatic thoughts in this triad, we just blow it way out of proportion. And so from this perspective, we go in and we challenge those thoughts. We try and change them, look at more realistic like thoughts to have related to that test or whatever it might be. Very, very common model that also explains a lot of depression in addition to the biology stuff. Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah, so it's very common that you see these things in depression, but you don't have to have depression to happen.
Now, I have a question, sorry, I'm trying to tell you to play that way. So I really didn't understand, there's so hard to understand the brain surface. And so like I Googled this video on YouTube and it explained it a little better. And from my understanding, brain surfaces are just they either die off or progress depending on the second relationship when as a child or I think you said so is it possible that conditions like cognitive therapy and biological therapy can go hand in hand when it comes to depression?
Sure.
And if that's the case, that's why the book was saying that a lot of therapy that is more successful is when it's a combination of not just like medication, but also therapy.
Yeah.
So without like,
Totally common. It happens a lot. A lot of people will go to therapy and also take a medication, right? So the medication is working on like the short-term effects of trying to balance the neurotransmitters to elevate mood enough that people can then benefit from the therapy, right? And then they work hand in hand and you might be able to go off the medication because you've learned better ways to handle it. A lot of people who have depression find ways to handle it on their own, right? A lot of people don't seek treatment, whether therapy or medication for money reasons, for attitude reasons, for accessibility, insurance, whatever it might be. And so you can learn to do some of these things even on your own, but if you learn better ways of interacting with the world, you can change your thoughts. It might also change your depression without ever needing it. But if you tackle them together and you're attacking it on two fronts or on multiple fronts, right, then it might alleviate it faster or increase your likelihood of being successful faster, which can turn things around, which can be much quicker. Right? So it's very common that they're used together. A lot of people see a psychologist to do something like, techniques like therapeutic techniques. And then they also see a psychiatrist or a doctor and take medication to boost each other. Very, very common. And I love that you looked it up and you wanted to do more. I think that's fantastic. That makes me happy. Anybody else? Any other thoughts or questions? Anything? All right. Then let's talk about bipolar disorder, right? The other big mood disorder. So we have depression. If somebody has a major depressive episode, then we could say they have unipolar depression, one pole, one side. Bipolar would mean two sides, right? They have both poles of mood, both extremes of mood. Now, as I said, this used to be called manic depression, but we've identified more than one type of like mania. There's something called hypomania, which we'll talk about on the next slide here when we get there in a second. But with bipolar disorder, people have alternating periods of mood, right? So in order to have bipolar disorder, you have periods of mania and periods of depression. And as I mentioned before, somebody might have depression for months or years without ever having a manic episode. And then if we eventually have a manic episode, then we would change the diagnosis. And that happens sometimes where somebody's diagnosis of depression then gets an addition, right? And we change it to bipolar. But with bipolar disorder, what we're seeing is normal mood, right? And then manic episodes and depressive episodes. And it's not typically like it's portrayed in the media, right? My mom always says stuff like when somebody's like really up and then really down, she'll be like, oh, you're being so bipolar, which is a little insensitive, but I know what she's trying to say. This tends to be something that's much longer lasting. Someone has a depressive episode, which is weeks, and then a manic episode, which is like 5 days to a week. And they might have normal mood in between for months, right? So this is a kind of a longer lasting thing than I think we tend to portray in the media. But in order to have bipolar disorder, you have to have a manic episode. So let's look at what are some of the symptoms of a manic episode. So just like we had a depressive episode, you can have a manic episode, and you have to have 3 or more symptoms. So we'll get a list of some of the symptoms. We have to have 3 or more of them lasting at least a week. Right, and they cause that significant distress and impairment that is kind of like a symptom of every single disorder that we talk about. All right, so 3 or more lasting a week. Now that's less time than a depressive episode, so only a week, but these symptoms tend to be somewhat severe. They can get people into trouble. Now, like any disorder, it exists on a spectrum. So some people have mania in a very like mild way, and other people can be very severe. Right, so a whole range, of course. So one of the symptoms is inflated self-esteem. Sometimes we call that grandiosity. So somebody's self-esteem is like very elevated, very high, and without reason to be, right? Like if you're like, well, your self-esteem is high, that doesn't sound so bad, right? It's often unwarranted, right? And you have grandiosity of like, I can accomplish anything, I can do anything, sometimes in a very exaggerated, like not grounded in reality kind of way. There's a decreased need for sleep. People in a manic episode oftentimes sleep very little. They're so up and agitated that it's difficult to sleep. They might not sleep at all, or they might only sleep for a couple of hours. It tends to be that you have a hard time calming down enough to sleep. There's a lot of talkativeness, so an increase in talking. Like a pressure to keep talking. It's almost like you can't stop, right? Like think about this as somebody, it's almost like you could compare it to somebody who's had way too much coffee, right? Like this part anyway, where they're so up and they're talking so fast and it's just like they don't stop, right? That kind of, I think, captures this element of it quite a bit. And then they might have what's called a flight of ideas. They're kind of all over the board, right? We'll talk about schizophrenia later in the semester, where people have what's called derailment, where their topics aren't even connected. This is just like a loose connection between things. They're kind of all over the board. They're talking about one thing, then they jump to another, then another, then another, then another. And they're like, their ideas are kind of all over the place. Racing thoughts is another way of thinking about that. Tend to be distracted. They tend to have that psychomotor agitation. Constantly fidgeting or tapping. So they might be sitting there like this, just tapping or fidgeting. You can't stop moving, which is something that you might also see in other disorders. But as part of this, it's often like fidgeting, tapping, or like really restless kind of movement. The last thing that we see a lot, and this is the one that gets people into trouble, is excessive involvement. This is how I can shorten this. So increased involvement in activities with high, I want to say it, shorten this, high potential for painful consequences. just say for consequences to be short. So a lot of involvement in activities that have a high potential for consequences. So shopping sprees, right? Drug use, unprotected sex, things that tend to get you into trouble. It's like your judgment is impaired. Sometimes people, this could be anger, they get into fights. It can be going on a shopping spree and spending a bunch of money that you don't have. It could be, like I said, using substances. It could be doing things that are dangerous. People tend to engage in activities that have a high potential for some kind of consequence, whether that's money or health or whatever it might be. There's a lot of poor judgment and planning. Sometimes people can be violent or just agitated and up. In very, very severe cases of mania, sometimes people will hallucinate, but that's not super common. You don't see that very often, but it can happen. It's more stuff like you're very up, you're agitated, you're not sleeping, you're not grounded in reality. So you have that kind of grandiosity, poor judgments, right? You're talking a lot, painful consequences. And again, on a spectrum. So for some people, this is relatively mild. For others, they can get themselves into a lot of trouble, a lot of debt, or whatever it might be that they engaged in. Yeah. That they engage in that behavior, because often it's due to this. There's just poor judgment, right? It's like that's not typically thought to be the motivation behind it. So there's a disorder that we'll talk about later in the semester called borderline personality disorder, or BPD for short. And it has this element as well, right? High potential for like engaging in things with consequences. But with that one, the motivation is often more to feel something different, change mood, or self-soothe in some way. Versus the motivation here is often that it's typically that there's just like a poor level of judgment, or like almost a complete lack of awareness of consequence, right? And that's where that grandiosity comes in of like, oh, I can do all these things and it'll be fine, right? And it might have some degree of like trying to fill a void, right? Or trying to like engage in that, but that's much more common to things like borderline personality. Yeah.
I noticed that a lot of the symptoms are similar to ADHD.
Yeah.
Distracted and stuff like that.
Sure.
So is that like ADHD, like a disorder of recurrent episodes?
No, so that's a great question, right? And they do. There's a lot of things that are in common, but this tends to be much more short-lasting, right? So manic episodes very rarely last more than like a couple of weeks. It's because people crash out, they're tired, right? They get into themselves into trouble, and it tends to kind of taper down. Versus the ADHD is so global, and it's something that doesn't really stop oftentimes for people. And so if you have ADHD, you might have that distractedness, that lack of attention, a hyperactivity, and some of those things. But it tends to be very global, and it doesn't go away. It's kind of always there. Versus this, you have a manic episode and then it's gone. And ADHD is much more common in children. And oftentimes people will outgrow it to a degree, versus this is much more common in adults. But they do share a few things in common, right? Some of those symptoms, can appear the same way, at least initially. And then you have to look a little more globally to see which one it's going to be. That's a great question. Yeah.
Long, I haven't gotten to this part, but what is the onset for bipolar disorder?
The age of onset. So it can happen in childhood. There's something called childhood bipolar disorder. It's relatively uncommon. Children don't have great emotion regulation already, right? It's part of like the defining characteristic of childhood. You have to learn to regulate and control your emotions. And so we typically don't diagnose this in childhood very often. It can be diagnosed in the adolescent years, but part of the adolescent years is trying to find your identity. There's often a lot of angst and like struggle, storm and stress in the adolescent years. So, this can start in the teen years, in early 20s, late teens, early 20s. It's really, really common, but it can definitely start earlier for people. It has a strong genetic component to it, and environmental stuff can trigger it. So you see it in teenagers for sure, but sometimes you have to differentiate that between, typical teenage development versus something more severe. I would say it's safe to say, like usually with disorders, unless they're a childhood disorder, we try and wait till after 18. We can kind of like the rough guideline, but you can see it across all of it, really. Did you have a?
Yeah. So the bipolar's media and the media, they kind of like most. Are you looking at the same time? And if so, how do you differentiate?
Sure, right, you could, it's totally possible, you can have more than one disorder, we call that like comorbidity, where two things go together. And so what you would look at is, like they could overlap, and when you're in a manic episode, the symptoms that you have of the ADHD might be more severe or intense than they would be when you weren't in a manic episode. But you would see some of these other things like this last one doesn't tend to be common with ADHD, right? And neither does like the grandiosity. Sleep, yes. Distracted, yes. Flight of ideas, yes. Self-esteem, not usually. Oftentimes people with ADHD, their self-esteem is lower because of the stigma that might be associated with it or the struggles they have. So it's a lot of looking at like, what are all of the symptoms and how are they all appearing together or separately? And you might see them be worse during the manic episode and then maybe cool down a little bit when somebody goes into like a depressive episode. But again, typically ADHD is much more childhood based. And this is a little bit later. So they might overlap, but it's not the most common, but it definitely can happen for sure. Anybody else? Any other? They're great questions. I love it. Yes. Sure.
If you see that particular experience on the show, to see if that's like an actual like the good word.
I haven't watched that show. I've heard that I should watch it, but I haven't watched it. I do have a clip that I'm going to share with you from Silver Linings Playbook, which is another movie that portrays this. They show it in more of like a kind of like the angry, violent portrayal, but it's still a decent portrayal of it. But I haven't. If you find a clip from it that highlights it, you can send it to me, and I'd be happy to watch it. There's a lot of movies and shows that feature it, but it is often featured very poorly, if that makes sense. So let me show you this clip. This is a great example of a manic episode. And again, the character who has this, you see him more on like the violent side, and people can go in that direction, or it can be more like poor judgment, poor planning, and painful consequences. Let me show you this. There's a little bit of swearing in it. I feel like I should tell you that for some reason. Okay. I would definitely recommend it. It's Silver Linings Playbook, just to say it one more time. A few years back, right, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. But they portray some of these symptoms here, right, where you see that like poor judgment and that anger, right? He like throws the book out the window. That's poor judgment and planning, not really like seeing beyond the moment. You see him not eating, not sleeping, right? He goes in at 4 in the morning and just like talking a million miles a minute to his parents, waking them up, not again, kind of poor judgment there. And then you also see he has a lot of that agitation, right? Like he's just constantly fidgeting. So, that's one portrayal of it. It can take a lot of different forms. There's an older movie too with Richard Gere, Mr. Jones. Also, he is another great example of this. He gets so caught up in the moment that he goes down onto a stage during a performance just because he's so taken up by the moment and gets arrested because of it. It's oftentimes, again, that people have kind of an involvement in things with high potential for consequences on a range. Of course, not everyone is that violent or angry, but it can take that form sometimes. As I said, there are two different types of bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. So bipolar 1 is the most traditional. Somebody who has full manic episodes and major depressive episodes. And so bipolar 1 is probably the closest to what we would have had of like manic depression. Somebody who has full manic, full depressive episodes. Bipolar 2 is less intense. People have what's called hypomania. I don't know if any of you had the thought at some point when I was talking about the manic symptoms, but like, oh, that could be maybe productive, right? Like I don't sleep as much. I have like more grandiosity, more self-esteem. Mania is very rarely productive. It's almost always like destructive in some way. But hypomania is like mania light. Somebody who sleeps less, have a little more self-esteem, but they're not as grandiose as somebody with mania. Hypomania can actually be quite productive if people harness it well. A lot of artists have struggled with bipolar disorder and used it in some way to harness their creativity. But hypomania is like mania light. It's mild mania. And so bipolar 2 is less severe, and that people have major depressive episodes. That's the same. The only difference is here they have mild mania or hypomania instead of full-blown manic episodes. So bipolar 2 is less intense than bipolar 1. There's also one other one called cyclophymic disorder. So people who have bipolar disorder are kind of like going like this, right? They have the manic episodes and the depressive episodes. Someone who has cyclophymic disorder doesn't quite go as high or as low, but they have like kind of constant fluctuations, a lot of hypomania and mild depression over 2 years. It's kind of like that other one, that dysthymic disorder that we talked about with depression. So you can have bipolar 1, which is the most severe, bipolar 2, which is a little less because it's hypomania, or you can have cyclophymic, which is mild mania and mild depression, but lasting for a very, very long time. Any other stories or comments or thoughts of anyone, know someone who has bipolar disorder? Any stories to share or comments to share? I always my mom had bipolar disorder, and it was always which version of her am I going to get today? It was always a lot of people nodded. God, that's very common with this disorder, where it can be difficult. It can feel like two different people. Like my mom would go through these phases where she wouldn't get out of bed, right? She'd be depressed, so she would sleep for hours and hours and hours, wouldn't get out of bed, no energy, didn't want to do anything. And then she'd shift to a manic episode weeks later, and she wouldn't sleep. She had a million, so much energy, wanted to do everything, wanted to be involved in everything. And it was just oh my gosh, who are you? Right? And then it would cycle back. And so it was a lot of never knowing what to expect. This can feel like two different people, depending on the severity of the disorder. And I remember my brother and I would always be which version are we going to get today? Because my mom definitely had bipolar 1. It was kind of very severe in her fluctuations, and they would last. And so it can be difficult if you know somebody with this. When it presents severely, this can be one of the harder disorders to manage and deal with. Yeah.
Really just normal.
Yeah.
So my dad, I guess, is just bipolar 1.
Mhm.
So he'll go 2 months with nothing. I just forget that he has it. Somebody has dad. And then just randomly he'll wake up in the morning and I happen to throwing things out from the fridge. He just doesn't think we need.
Yeah.
And we go into the rafters and the garage and the attic, and he's working on everything. And my mom had no idea how to handle it.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden he crashed.
Yeah.
And he won't get off out of there. And I always tell my friends when they come over, where it's oh, we're always at my house. Yeah, but I never know which side of my dad are going to see it.
Yeah.
He can be aggravated and angry and yelling, or real cool and chill and just my dad,
Mhm.
So it's when we always say that we're walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
You just never know exactly what you're going to get.
And thank you so much for sharing that, right? That's such a common thing to say about someone who has this disorder, that you feel like you're walking on eggshells, you don't know what to expect. And like you said, you'll be normal for a few months and you almost forget about it. And then that episode comes and you're oh, there, I can see it. You can see it, right? There's behaviors that are very noticeable. And that happens there. There can be normal mood for months, and then someone has a depressive episode, and they might be more likely to have depression and very rarely have mania, or more likely to have mania and very rarely have depression. But yeah, that's what makes it so tricky, is you sometimes don't know what's going to be, what person you're going to get that day. And that can make it difficult. Yeah.
I don't have bipolar, but I do have borderline.
Uh-huh.
So with mania, I had a manic episode once. Kind of embarrassing, but it's fine.
Thank you for sharing. It's okay. We won't do it.
I had a manic episode once where I met a guy on a dating app online who lived in Canada, and then that night we decided we were going to move in together, and I bought a plane ticket to Canada, and I was going to go fly to him and move in with him. And then, my mom was like, no.
Right.
And then, when the manic episode ended, I was like, might have been a bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's that grandiosity, right? It's just in the moment, you're so swept up in the moment that you forget to be grounded in reality, right? And then when you got out of that episode, you're like, yeah, it's good that I did it, right? But in that moment, I'm going to buy the plane ticket, I'm going to go, it's just perfect, everything's free. And thank you for sharing that. It's you're almost like tunnel vision, right? That's all you see. You don't see the consequences. And there's a lot of overlap with bipolar disorder and borderline. They have they're very commonly misdiagnosed. One is much more global. Borderline tends to start from a young age. It's more pervasive, and shows in a little different way. We'll talk about it later, but they do have elements in common. Sometimes people can have both. And during those episodes, it can be hard to control them. And then, you cycle out of it and deal with the consequences sometimes. So, anybody else? Any other thoughts or stories, comments, anything? Thank you for all of you sharing. I love it. Thank you. I think it just adds to it. Like I said, I grew up with a mom who had this, and she still has it. Like it was like I don't know, I want to say it was like 6 months or 7 months ago. She lived here for a time and then she moved back to Wisconsin, but she came over to our house and she was in a manic episode. And my partner, even though we've been together 18 years, had never seen 19 years. And I should figure that out before August, 18 or 19, one or the other. But my mom came over and she was in the middle of a manic episode. And like my partner had never seen that. And it was so obvious. She was just like, okay, let's go do this. It was just like so frantic. And we were both just like almost backing away from her, like, Mom, calm down. It's okay. And she was just like, all right, we're going to go do this and this and this. And then the next week, it was like, I couldn't get her out of bed, and so it can be that intense. And like you said, with your dad, you can often see it right away and identify it if it's something you're used to seeing. Just a couple other things, the causes of bipolar disorder and then the treatments. And again, this can be on a spectrum. There are a lot of people who have bipolar disorder and manage it and do okay with it. It doesn't have to be some massively difficult disorder, but it can be, right? Like any other disorder that we're talking about. But it has a lot of the same culprits, which shouldn't be surprising. It's another mood disorder, right? So we see neurotransmitters playing a role, either overactive or underactive. Right? Remember, like low activity could be a hallmark of the depression side, and overactivity on the flip side could be a hallmark of the manic side. So we see a lot of the same neurotransmitters, but we add an interesting element, ion activity. Right? So when we have our neurons communicating with each other, you ready for this epically awful neuron? Okay, so here's my neuron. I'm not an artist. See that here? Okay, so this, I mean, it could be weird, but kids are always like, I'll have mom draw it. So like, if this was a neuron, right, those are the dendrites, in the learning, right? Inside and outside of the neuron, you have these little ions. Right, so positive ions and negative ions and so on. Right, these little ions are the electrical piece of electrochemical communication that happens with our neurons. The chemical piece are the neurotransmitters that flow across, like dopamine and serotonin and so on. It's thought that there might be an ion level issue that people have that might be struggling or contributing to the bipolar element of it, right? That the neurons are either firing too quickly or they're too stubborn in their firing. And so something with the positive and negative element of that ion activity is playing a role. And you'll see this come back when we talk about the treatments, because one of them targets this element specifically. But it's thought that there's some kind of improper transport of these positive and negative ions that plays a role in this disorder. Right? We don't fully understand it, but it is a kind of a theory. Same thing with brain structures. There's a couple of brain structures that tend to appear differently in people who have bipolar disorder. Now, is it bipolar a cause of that, or does bipolar cause it? Or is it just correlational? We don't know. But this one is another big one, genetics. Just like depression, there's a genetic element to it, right? So a lot of people who have a biological parent who has bipolar disorder, it might make you more vulnerable. Again, it doesn't mean you have to have it, but it might be something that you might be more susceptible to because of genetics. But the first two are the big ones. Neurotransmitters and ions play a big role in this disorder. And so as a result, we tend to use a different group of medications to help with bipolar disorder. Right? And these medications are called mood stabilizers. If this was your mood, up and down and up and down and up and down, a mood stabilizer tries to do this, right? So instead of the ups being so high and the downs being so low, we kind of shrink it into the middle and stabilize your mood a little bit, right? So bringing the ups down, and the downs up to kind of meet in the middle. So mood stabilizer drugs, there's several of them, but the most common one is a drug called lithium. Lithium is very commonly prescribed for people who have bipolar disorder. It works better on the manic side of controlling mania, so people might also take an antidepressant. But lithium is a metallic element, right? It's on the periodic table, right? It's a naturally like occurring mineral salt. The mineral salt, sodium, is one of our positive ions, right? So it's thought to affect us on an ion level rather than a neurotransmitter level. And that's what is playing some role in controlling the depression and the mania side, kind of bringing them together. Now, lithium can be a very dangerous drug. If you're taking it, you're typically being monitored very closely. You have to have blood work done periodically to make sure it's not too much in your system. It has a lot of side effects, but it is one of the more commonly used mood stabilizing drugs to help people suffering from bipolar disorder. Much more so helpful with the mania than the depression, but still, it's very commonly used. And then oftentimes therapy as well. Right? A lot of people with bipolar disorder would go to therapy, and maybe they're on medication in conjunction with therapy as a way to tackle it together, like we were talking about earlier. But a lot of medication for bipolar disorders, and it might be more than one medication. So lithium, and then also an antidepressant, right? Very common for people to take more than one if they're struggling with bipolar disorder. Yeah.
I know this might be dumb, but is this something for use for the batteries?
No, right? Or, I mean, there is a lithium like element to it. Like lithium is like I said, it's a mineral salt, right? And it is like, we often compare these to like the positive and negative ends of a battery. So, I mean, honestly, I'm not sure if like, there's one in the lithium. I'm assuming it's coming from somewhere. I'm gonna look that up. I'm not sure, right? So it wasn't a dumb question at all. I'm not sure that we need to do it. Yeah.
Deal with like bipolar or game one depression. Have they found like maybe some evidence as to why some people deal with it better than others? For example, the reason why I ask is because there's been some evidence that like the sociopathy is genetic. However, if you grow up in a living household as the young person, they can't develop like drugs and sociopaths are low.
Okay.
But, like, no. So would that be like the same thing for this type of disorder? You like your resilience to express?
Sure.
Have it found to see like why some people do better than others?
Yeah, and so resiliency, like you mentioned the word resilient, right? Resiliency is actually a really strong predicting factor in a lot of disorders. And if somebody grows up in a family that has really good like control over emotions, they talk about emotions, they work through them, you know, they might have this to a way lesser degree than in a family where it's maybe more toxic or more violent or aggressive. I mean, the things that you experience play a big role. We often talk about mental illness. There's this model called the Psychopathological Model that talks about how disorder are almost like a perfect cluster of causes, right? That maybe you're born with a genetic predisposition, but then your environment also triggers it. Right? So let's say you're born with a disposition to get depression, with a genetic predisposition, but the environment that you grow up in is really loving and nurturing and like positive emotions like are pretty typical. You may or may not develop it to the same extent that you would have had you grown up in a different environment. Right, so environment can definitely play a role, and sometimes this stuff is modeled in a way, right? It can become the normal. Right, if you grow up in a household where somebody has this, like it becomes normal to you. And so, yeah, those factors can definitely play a role, and a lot of people learn to manage this on their own. They identify like, okay, I'm in a manic episode. I need to be more mindful of my behavior, or I'm in a depressive episode. I'm going to need to push myself, and those are things that I've learned. And that resiliency is a big part of that. So yes, it can definitely play a role in how well people cope with it or how intensely it presents itself and so on. Other questions, comments, anything? You moved. I thought you were raising your hand. Yeah. See, I had it. I knew it. Like you moved and I got excited.
Positive, like I know like a lot of it's touched in the brain and like the genetics and stuff like that. But does it like develop over time, or does it, can it be like triggered by like the environment and stuff? I noticed like it's still relying on Playbook, like his, like, sort of like triggered by like a traumatic event in his life. So, would that be one of the causes as well, or is it?
Yeah. That's a great question. So there's a model, and this is really applicable to schizophrenia, but it's applicable to any disorder as well. It's called the diaphysis stress perspective. Right, and the idea with this is that you have a genetic predisposition that may or may not be realized depending on the environment. Right, so let's say that you have a genetic predisposition to develop bipolar disorder, but you grew up kind of like your question, right? You grew up in an environment where you don't have exposure to anything that's triggers it. You may or may not ever develop this. Right, versus you have something traumatic happen or something difficult happen, too much stress. All of those things might then trigger that predisposition. So it can happen either way, where somebody genetically develops it and it just kind of builds over time. You might see some evidence when they're younger, but a lot more when they're older. Or it could be that you see nothing and there's some kind of traumatic event or stressful event that triggers it to come forward. So it can go either way. And it can kind of go away on its own, or it could be requiring treatment for a long period of time. And I have a video that I want to show you. I'll show it to you next class because we're obviously almost at the end here. But I'll show you a video related to lithium. Lots of songs written about lithium. So I'll share one with you next time that I think does a good portrayal of it. But we'll pick up here when I see you on Thursday, right? So yep, see you on Thursday. Don't make sure you signed in before you take off.